All right. I think I'm supposed to get us started. I think that's what we agreed to. So as we wrap up our kind of SELT sessions today, we wanted to make sure we kind of circle back to the idea of creating an inclusive classroom climate. So we have kind of 4 topics on our agenda. So that's kind of first impressions, building community, transparent class structure, and class participation and engagement. We have many ideas for each of those kind of categories. Perhaps you might try something in each category, but definitely don't try all the things. That would be crazy. That's too many things, right? So there's lots of opportunities, and we hope someone can pick something that will connect with them. So one thing that we want to make sure we put out front as we discuss this is that making a classroom inclusive and an environment inclusive isn't something that just happens naturally or, magically. It requires a lot of planning, important intention, structure, and effort, in part because we all have really good intentions. We all really probably intend to be very inclusive of everybody, but we all have biases that we're unaware of. And so if we're not really intentional, then, we might miss things.
And in particular, having structure is one important component of providing an inclusive classroom, as we'll see as we move through this. One of the most important things is to create good first impressions, create an environment that welcomes students to your classes. And it's really helpful if you can do that before the actual first meeting of the class or before things get underway. And there's a number of ways of doing that. One is you could just send a welcome email, or you could create a welcome video where you introduce yourself and talk about the class, but focus on the things that students will learn and all the interesting and exciting things you're going to do and why it matters to help create an environment where students are going to be curious, they're going to be motivated to start the class.
And establish yourself as a human. Important.
And when you create your syllabus, consider using what's called either the promising or now the invitational syllabus by Ken Bain, who first developed the idea. And many of our syllabi read as if they're a penal code, listing all the things that students can do based on a long history of things that students have done in the past and all the penalties and all the guidelines and so forth. What Ken Bain suggests, and many people suggest, is that instead, build the same type of thing I mentioned before about your video into your syllabus. Talk about why the class is important, how it fits into your students' career and their educational plans, and what they're going to take from the class that will allow them to be more successful and productive in the future.
And we can't be in a room with me without me saying accessibility is important. So making sure your document itself is digitally accessible is really important. This is one of the first kind of sharing of materials that you have with students. And if they can't get the material, right, they can't use the technology that they use with the syllabus and they can't get all the information, then you're already setting up a giant barrier at the start of the class and you're kind of indicating that you don't care. So spending some time on that particular document is really important. Likewise, along the lines of John mentioning that it looks like a penal code and it's really great for reading, thinking about having a more of a newsletter or brochure feel to the style of the document could be really helpful in feeling inviting or something that someone might actually want to look at or read. As long as we're also thinking about kind of accessibility practices while we're doing that. And it is possible to make something that looks great and is also accessible.
And along the same lines, you can also create your syllabus as a website. There's something called I think it's a liquid syllabus, where you post your syllabus online and it contains the same information, but it can have perhaps better design features in it than what many of us would do if we were not Rebecca, but many of us would do if we were putting it in a PDF, for example. Another thing you can do is have students take ownership of parts of the class, give them some say in how the class is going to be structured. Talk to them at the beginning of the class. Don't lock in the syllabus necessarily at the start of the class, but open the class especially if you're going to be meeting synchronously, by sharing the syllabus, perhaps in advance, and saying, some of these things we can talk about in terms of how you would like to be able to demonstrate that you've achieved content mastery and so forth. Put in your learning objectives, but maybe talk to the students about how they're going to be assessed, what methods they found that worked for them successfully in the past. And when students are there, they'll often suggest more stringent types of rules than you would have suggested on many of these things. But once they have a say in how the class is going to be structured and how classes will take place, they tend to get much more engaged in the class. One thing you can do is a very simple thing you could do is if you have your syllabus as a PDF, upload it, but upload it into Blackboard or whatever LMS we'll be using in the future.
Or a Google Doc.
Or a Google Doc, but allow for annotations. Use, for example, hypothesis to let students ask questions about the syllabus and to give feedback and to make suggestions in the syllabus.
I did this in the last year and it was super successful. It got some really great questions and we had some really interesting dialogues about why certain things were in the syllabus or why particular assignments right at the start of the semester. So I highly encourage that activity, and that also gives time for students to reflect on the syllabus and then maybe negotiate or make some changes after people have a chance to read and annotate.
2 of the 3 classes I taught last semester, I did that. I shared a draft of the syllabus in advance, and we spent a good portion of the first class day just going through and revising it and finalizing the syllabus. And another thing we can do is establish some ground rules for the class in terms of class discussions, in terms of how you can have productive discussions, especially if there's going to be some challenging issues that you're going to discuss. And having students discuss that and come up with rules that they have a say in creating can create a much better environment for open discussion.
There's a lot of folks that write about this, and many of them also suggest maybe having some started because kind of starting with a blank sheet can be difficult. So having some kind of drafts of things or ideas to start with can also be really helpful at sparking a conversation, and having time for folks to reflect a little bit or having some time to think before having to contribute to a conversation will also make sure that all voices are included.
So then we were going to talk a little bit about how to help students feel more like human beings. And one of the simplest things you can do is learn their names and learn how to pronounce their names. I know when Rebecca and I record a podcast, one of the first things we do is we ask people how they pronounce their names. It's easy when it's one-on-one. When you have a larger class, that may be a little bit tougher. And a really good strategy for that is to use something like Flipgrid and ask students just to either give an introduction and tell the class a little bit about themselves, or at the very least, just have them record their name. And so you can listen to it later and learn how to pronounce the names. And so other people in the class can learn how to pronounce their names. Just knowing students' names is a really effective strategy in helping students feel more a part of the class community, as is asking students for their preferred pronouns and encouraging them to set them in Zoom if you're meeting in Zoom. But in general, just asking them to share that initially creates a much more welcoming environment.
I was much more intentional about this in the past year. And there's a student that I'd had multiple times that I didn't know how to say her full name. I only knew how to say her nickname, and also realized I'd been saying her nickname incorrectly for a while. And she had never corrected me because I had her record a video, and she was so gracious and said her name really slow and she just really did a good job of helping everyone pronounce it. And then I could call her by her actual name. And I felt terrible that I had been so horrible prior to that. But so doing that video thing was really helpful because I literally watched that video a lot of times to get it down. So along those same lines, I forgot we were co-doing this. I was like, oh, it's John's thing. So along those lines, text introductions are great, but that audio video piece makes a big difference. If you can get students to do it, huge difference. I also use some prompts about something that they had spent time learning that was not related to school and had become kind of developed some expertise in, and it facilitated an amazing conversation among students, and students found all kinds of connections with each other. And I learned really interesting things about my students that I had never learned prior to kind of having a prompt like that.
And those connections can also help you structure class discussions of various topics, because if you know that there's some things your students are really interested in, and if you know why they're in your class and what their goals and objectives are, you can try to make more connections for them. Just when you're finding examples, you can use things that are more likely to relate to the interests of your students.
One of my students did the coolest designs for lacrosse sticks. And I like, I had no idea what that process was like. And he like mapped it all out, and like we asked questions about it, and he like shared a whole thing about how he does it. So it was really cool. So you never know, where you can bring things in. So, when you're in person, it can be easy maybe to build in, arrive early, stay late. You can do it a little bit online too if you're doing something synchronously. But finding some way to transition into class and transition out of class can be really helpful. I've been finding doing kind of little warm-up activities that are creative in the kinds of classes I teach at the beginning can be really helpful to kind of loosen students up, bond over things, silly activities or whatever that are just meant to kind of transition into a classroom space, and that routine around kind of doing that transition can be helpful. But things like doing a poll or watching a quick video or listening to music or doing collaborative drawing or something together as a way to kind of say like, we're in this space now and we're going to start thinking about something else can be really helpful to give people time to just get in their place.
And if you're going to be doing group activities in class, when you first start it, encourage them to introduce themselves to each other so that they get more comfortable, and makes it easier for them to become actively engaged in that.
That's something that's not obvious. Like students often need to be told that that's what they need to do first when they get into a group. Otherwise it's really awkward. And if we don't invite them to do that piece, right, like they don't know to do that. I mean, I don't know how many of you have been in a random breakout room for like a faculty development thing or whatever, and people just like look at each other, they don't know what to do. So having a way to do that's helpful.
And I first really noticed this. I was presenting at a conference at OLC about 3 years ago, the Online Learning Consortium, and I was working with Judy Littlejohn, who's been on the podcast, and some of you know her. And we asked people to meet. We had people group at tables to talk about a topic, and they just sit there. And then Judy actually said, okay, you guys are not doing this. Talk to each other, introduce yourselves, let the other people know where you're from and why you're at this session and so forth. And then the conversations just started. Just breaking the ice that way is a really good way of getting group activities started.
So our next section is on kind of transparent class structure, which is really important and is, definitely something that we'll be emphasizing in the fall with our academic affairs speakers and some of the work that we'll be doing around inclusive pedagogy in the next academic year.
Because one of the things they emphasize is the importance of structure and making clear to students exactly what they're going to be learning, how it's going to be structured, and details on everything that they're going to be doing in class so that they don't get lost along the way.
Our speakers are VG Sathi and Kelly Hogan. We didn't mention that.
And focus very closely on your learning objectives. It's really easy to throw in a lot of other things that you find interesting, but if they're not tied to what you want students to come out of the class with, it might be better to use that time to focus more productively on the things that students do need to complete the course successfully. I know we all tend to do that to some extent, but it's important to maintain that focus, and it makes it easier for students to see the relevance of what's being done in the class.
And not to just put it on the syllabus and ignore it forever, but to actually revisit a particular objective for a particular assignment or the objectives for the specific day or class session. Along those same lines of kind of providing clarity and transparency, thinking about rubrics or checklists for assignments and providing those up front. Remember that if you're using our LMS and you put a rubric in, like the default is not to make it visible to students. So you do need to like actively make sure that you're doing that. Again, along those same lines, like if you have these expectations, you should show students what those expectations look like. What does mastery look like so that students really know what they're kind of striving towards or what they're trying to achieve. Providing deadlines in advance along those same lines is really helpful for students to plan their time. The surprise reveal is not great for many students. So having deadlines on your syllabus, and trying to stick to them, like trying to stay on track throughout the semester, is really helpful to students because they may be organizing work schedules or other life things around that schedule. And so when it changes, it disrupts their attempts to kind of stay on task. And as John just mentioned a minute ago, and it's worth repeating many times, is that you want to make sure that your assessments and the activities that you're including align with your course objectives. And if they don't, perhaps that's the thing that we cut so that we have more time to stay on task. Now, that said, doing things to establish community may be really important to achieving an objective. So don't overlook those things if like kind of that sense of belonging or community is really important. If we're going to do collaboration or collaborative work in the class, that's going to be really important if that's a skill set you want them to develop.
And that point about providing examples of what mastery looks like is really important because we know what we want students to submit, but students often see it as that's a big part of the game of being successful in the class, trying to figure out what the instructor wants on an assignment. And what often happens is students won't do very well the first couple of times until they get some feedback and they learn what you want. It's much more effective if we let them know what they're being evaluated on at the start before they actually do the task, so it's not a surprise to them. And again, with the rubrics, sharing them with the students is helpful because while Blackboard does hide them by default, it also doesn't make it possible or easy for students to see them before they actually submit the assignment. So, create a document with your rubrics, share it with the students. It could be included as part of the syllabus if you'd like, but make sure it's visible. And you also give it to them when they start the assignment, saying, this is how you're going to be evaluated on this, so they know what to focus on and what you're expecting them to do, rather than surprising them with that when they get graded on it. Okay, so another thing that's really helpful is to move away from high stakes assessments, provide low stakes assessments to let students know what they're learning, how well they've learned it, and to make it possible for them to improve their understanding. Students get really discouraged if they have a high stakes test that's 20 or 30% of their grade and they fail it. It's kind of too late for them to get much benefit from that right then, unless you give them some mechanism for catching up. Give students feedback early and often on all their work, or as much work as you can. And if that's too much work because you're giving them lots of little tasks to do, let them give feedback to each other. But also make sure that that feedback is accurate by perhaps having a whole class discussion or providing examples of effective work.
And that low stakes work should be related to anything that might be high stakes, right? So if you're going to have multiple choice tests, then some of the low stakes things should be similar kinds of questions. Don't, if you're going to give them practice, make sure they're practicing what they're actually going to be doing. That's going to count more.
And that's something Jim Lang emphasizes in his book, Small Teaching, that, if students are going to be practicing with low stakes activities, what you ultimately test them on should be reflected in the types of assessments you use to give them that practice experience, as Rebecca said. But one thing is that students believe that they learn more effectively, partly because they've heard it from many of us over the years, if they just read something over and over again. I know one of our colleagues says, I've always told my students that you need to read something 3 times. And if you read it 3 times, you'll remember it forever. And I said, well, that's not really what the evidence shows. And well, in any case, what happens basically is students tend to believe that because when they read something, they get this fluency illusion, they recognize it, it looks familiar, then they get to a test and it doesn't look the same. And then now forced to try to apply it in a context that doesn't have the same layout on the page as what they're familiar with. So let them know that it's good to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes, that you learn more when you make a mistake at something and then get feedback that allows you to correct it than if you happen to do it correctly the very first time you tried it. So let them know that making mistakes is part of learning. And you can provide lots of examples of that, that they're going to be familiar with, like learning how to ride a bicycle or other things, or in sports. You try something, you make mistakes, and you learn from it. And we need to provide those same opportunities for students in our classes and help them understand that that's an important part of learning. And you can also relate it in your discipline to how researchers made mistakes, but they tried things and they learned from those mistakes.
One of the things that's up here too is just making sure that you're explicit about how those things calculate into a grade. And that's really important because students sometimes get really panicky if they do poorly on something that's low stakes, but it's meant to be practice, right? So if it counts very little and it's not really going to impact their grade in any great way, like it's helpful for them to know and understand that. And we might need to point it out to them. Likewise, we want to make sure that they're not spending like way too much time on something that counts very little. And so sometimes if it's just a graded activity, they think of it as it's a grade and they might put way more effort into something that's really meant to be a quick thing. So being explicit and transparent about that can be really helpful and supportive for students.
And giving them opportunities to redo when possible is also helpful, so that if they get it wrong, if they can try it again, it won't matter, and remind them of that. The next thing is related to that revision, scaffold hires. Well, Rebecca already talked a little bit about that if they're going to do some high stakes activities, let them practice all the components of that earlier on and give them that feedback and revision.
And reflection is actually incredibly important to learning. And we all kind of know that, but we often don't build in enough time for that or think of it as like a quick, like low stakes assignment at the end of another assignment, rather than really taking it maybe as seriously as it is to the learning process. So offer some time and space to really process what they've learned and how the new information or the new experience connects to past experiences or prior knowledge, or how it might challenge those prior experiences and prior knowledge, and asking really explicit questions that get to those points, and then grading with a rubric that gets to that idea, so that you don't end up with a bunch of description, because that's not reflection, which is often what students think is reflection, right? It's just like a summary of whatever it is that they did. So having really good prompts that get to kind of this critical lens is important. And this also includes providing time for teams to reflect, especially if you're doing something that might be persistent teams, where they might be working with the same group of students for a period of time. So one thing that I've been doing that's worked really well in this realm is doing what's called a retrospective. And you can do that kind of at different increments through the project. And there's different models, but one that's super easy to implement is using like a whiteboard or a Google Doc or something like that, where they can collaborate together, have 3 categories: start, stop, and continue. And you ask the students to think about what should their team start doing, what should their team stop doing, and what should their team continue doing. And kind of using a timed setting to allow students to all independently contribute to that document within a team, and then giving them time to talk about it can be really helpful at kind of fleshing out any potential issues that might be arising early on in a process and throughout a project, right? As life gets in the way, different issues arise at different points in a project, and giving that time and space to process that can be really helpful. Another really important inclusive practice is being flexible. And I know we've all had a lot of exercise and practice at flexibility over the last 18 months. I don't know about you, but like I am way more flexible than I used to be. Maybe not like yoga flexible, but like, sitting in this chair is not helping, right? But definitely in terms of thinking about accommodating students, addressing kind of mental health issues, and a wide variety of other kind of challenges that we've all faced. So one way to be flexible is actually providing digital materials in an accessible format, because it allows students to use a wide variety of technology with it. So an accessible document can be read out loud to them, can be searched, etc. So it allows a lot of different ways to interact with it. You also want to think about course content and resources provided in multiple formats. So maybe you have a particular topic you want to address, but you've also made sure it's in, you've got maybe a video that's about it, maybe you've got a reading about it, and maybe an activity about it. And you've also brought in diverse perspectives, right? So there's a lot of different ways to kind of connect with the content or the topic. And then finally, another way to be really flexible, and students like having agency, it motivates them, is providing multiple ways for students to demonstrate mastery of learning objectives. So maybe that means doing an essay or allowing them to do a podcast instead of a traditional research paper, but offering options can be important. Obviously, I teach in an area where the kind of the medium is sometimes important, right? Like I might be teaching web design, therefore they need to do web design, right? Like that is the course. But there's ways to still build in kind of other places where there could be flexibility. So for example, in a reflection, maybe it's written, but maybe it's a video, right? So there's different ways to build in flexibility. Maybe it can't be on everything, but providing some of that throughout the semester can be really supportive for students.
So you also want to provide lots of ways for students to participate in class. And one way of doing it is by giving them opportunities for doing that with polling software. There's lots of software out there that you can use that are free, and we may have a license for one by the end of the summer. And the questions could be open-ended responses where you could perhaps use them even to generate a word cloud or something, just to see what concepts were coming up if you have a large class. You could use virtual whiteboards. Rebecca had a presentation on that yesterday. You know, we've used Jamboards for many sessions over this workshop and the last couple of workshops series. Or you could use a waterfall chat series, or a chatterfall, it's also called, where you just ask students to all, if you're on Zoom, ask students to all type something into the chat, but don't press return until you tell them to. And then all of a sudden you see a whole range of responses that everyone can view all at once. So you want to provide mechanisms for students to participate in the discussion, because even if you're in a classroom, if you have a larger class, it's hard to hear from all the voices. And some students are not that comfortable, or they may be from cultures where it's more difficult to volunteer and to speak, while other people are really comfortable being the dominant voices all the time in your classroom. So you want to provide opportunities to give everyone a chance to speak, and using some type of a back channel or polling software or virtual whiteboards or the waterfall chat, if you're using Zoom, would be a good way to get lots of voices being heard at once in a way that's more comfortable for all the students.
Michael has a question about clicker devices. So right now might be a really good moment to ask.
I just know that I'm going to miss the chat when we return to face-to-face.
Yes.
And I was just wondering, John or Rebecca, like, are there any not devices that are ready yet, I guess, but are folks thinking about trying to make the clicker into like a chat that could be like shared on the screen or something like that?
The main barrier, and this is something I've been asking from CTS for about 12 years now, is having a second screen in the classroom, both for the instructor and also a second display screen. We now have that in a few classrooms. We got it first over in Shineman in many classrooms, and we had it in my classroom until, you know, we went remote. But or at least I had a second screen. But if you have a second screen, there's many tools you can open up and let students participate in. And there's lots of ways of doing that. One is if you're using Google Slides, you can go into presentation mode and let students, and there'll be a little code at the top, a short URL that students can choose, and then they can just type things into that can be seen by everyone. And that's a good tool. Or you could just do it periodically, or some people even have opened up Twitter for this use, where they just have a class hashtag and the instructor might be monitoring it, or someone might be monitoring it, and it's basically a back channel. There's other back channel tools that people can use to have a second, have another discussion thread going on at the same time that can be accessed from mobile devices and so forth.
That's Michael. That's one way that I use Slack as well in my classes. So that's like a chat or discussion kind of messaging application. So that's another way. If you're going to use it for other things, you could have a channel open for kind of as a back channel in class.
I think I'll just start experimenting.
That's what we all do. You have our permission to experiment. And remember, learning means sometimes we fail.
And letting students know that too, that, you know, when we try new things, sometimes they don't work. It's sometimes good to model that. Maybe not all the time, but modeling that and explicitly mentioning that can be useful.
So one of the things, you just skipped the slide, John, but
did I?
Yeah. So this ties exactly into what we were just talking about, is this one right here. It's eliciting feedback from students, right? So we might be trying or experimenting something in class. So, you know, checking with students about it can be helpful, but just checking in generally and thinking, treating our students a little bit as collaborators and partners rather than, opposition or something by doing polls or exit tickets or surveys or whiteboard kind of activities where you're soliciting some feedback from students about kind of what to keep doing, maybe what to change, or, things that they maybe have been doing in other classes that they'd like to see you try, and that's not to say you have to do all of the things, right, or change anything, but at least hearing from students about their experience can be informative.
Now, one more thing about the clickers is that, thinking of it this way, it looks as if we're going to have a license for up to 1,500 students per semester for iClicker Cloud, where you could just periodically ask students to type something in. I suppose you could leave it open all the time and students could just submit things. And in fact, I have done that using other software in the past, but that does allow free response. It works on student mobile devices or from any web-based device. And built into it is an exit ticket tool where when you end the class session, it prompts you with a question. Do you want to run an exit ticket? So if you're using that for software, it would already be built into the system where it's even reminding you to do it when you close the polls for the day. So yeah, there's a lot of polling software that would do it. And in fact, it looks like we may have a license for at least, well, up to 1,500 students a semester.
So we've talked about many of these strategies already, using the back channel for sure, but also thinking about, instead of always asking for an answer, especially a question that might have a right or wrong answer, asking students for questions that are interesting and creative and kind of challenging students to contribute by asking really good questions is also a way of really inviting students to participate without there being so much pressure.
And related to that, we can tie in active learning activities. But one way where students may not feel that comfortable is participating in a large group. Small group activities is a really good way of doing that. So if you want to get input from students, a simple way of doing it is a think, pair, share. You give them something to think about, have them think about it first, then discuss it with each other, and then invite one of them to share the group's response. Because if someone is unwilling to raise their hand or volunteer to state their own opinion, they're much more willing it's more comfortable to share what the group discussed. And that can make it a little bit more effective. And I think you've heard many of these things: jigsaw techniques, fishbowls, gallery walks, team-based learning, project-based learning, or group problem sets where you have students work in small groups could be a really good way of getting everyone involved all the time, or a good portion of the time, in working with the rest of the class. Okay.
So as you can see, based on the kind of categories and things that we have here, nothing is maybe completely unusual in this set. But these are all principles that really lead to a much more inclusive climate from the start. And don't underestimate how much spending a little time on the syllabus or thinking about how you're welcoming students into the class, like how much those things that might seem kind of small actually make a really big impact at the very start of the semester and get people to feel like they belong, and they belong in this learning environment, they belong in the community. And this is what we want. We want our students to feel like they can succeed.
Does anyone have any questions or suggestions on how to help form a more inclusive class environment?
Or even strategies you've been using over the past year that you want to share related to this idea? I did put the link to the slide deck in the chat for anyone that might want to revisit some of the ideas and think about how that might play out for them in the next academic year. Again, there's a lot of ideas that we just shared with you in a short amount of time. And obviously, doing all of them is not a possible task, and you should not try to do all of the things, but try one or two, right? To see and incrementally kind of include more of these kinds of practices as you move forward to establish that sense of belonging for our students.
And a couple of things that, in case you hadn't seen the chat, Kristen had said first is that she had just seen a fabulous presentations on the importance of belongingness for underrepresented students, and learning names was a big part of that. And she also noted that when we were discussing the community building and forming connections among the students, that it was amazing how many of these practices directly align to good supervision practices as well, just replacing a few words here and there. Because basically it involves how to create an effective teamwork, which applies to class as well as to supervision.
One of the things I've done some research recently with students with disabilities at our school and also at SUNY Geneseo. And one of the things that a lot of students said about like ways they've felt included are really simple, like calling them by name and that their instructor knows their name. Like that immediately already makes them feel like they belong, right? Or not questioning why they might have an accommodation. Right? Or challenging that they're trying to use their accommodation in your class, right? Some really basic things actually help students feel included and like they belong, right? And they don't have to always be a heavy lift.
This reminds me of something I heard on a podcast, one of Bonnie Stachowiak's podcast, where she mentioned a psych experiment where there were people in a room with multiple recorded multiple conversations going on. They were scripted and they weren't really focusing on any of them. But what happened is once one of those conversations mentioned their name, their focus went immediately to that. So not only does including students' names help create a more inclusive environment by making people feel part of the class and being recognized as human beings, it's a really good way of getting people's attention, and thanking them for their contributions by name would be really helpful.
So if there's no questions or no one wants to share some of their practices, we can definitely thank you for joining. All right, so Michael, I'm mute. You want to share something, Michael?
I mean, just in regards to the names, because I learned names, and it's not enough to say I'm bad with names, because like everybody's bad with names. It's hard to remember 100 names and 100 faces, but I use the note cards and I practice beforehand. I practice before class and maybe like the first minute or two of class, because then it's like, even if it takes you 75% of the semester to get to 80 or 90 or 100% with the names, like they see you putting in the time too. And so just something simple.
Yeah, and now that we have class lists with pictures, right? Like printing those out and like using them like flashcards can be really helpful, because you can kind of associate the name with the face. Perhaps maybe more helpful if there's not a mask covering a face, but
I should also say too, I have for the large classes done seating assignments, but it's just by row. So like after the first 2 weeks, you pick your row. I don't care where you sit, just because it does get to be very, very difficult if they choose new seats every day.
Although students will almost always sit in the same seats they sat in the first day. And so that makes it so much easier to do that. I have the same problem with names, and it seems to be getting worse over the years. One thing I'm really going to miss about Zoom, there's not that much I miss about teaching over Zoom, but one thing I'm going to miss is the names on the screens, because that's made it so much easier to call people by name.
And of course, if you're teaching a larger class or whatever, you can ask students to use like a table tent or something to at least help you start learning names, right? And telling them that that's how you're using them initially. It also helps them learn each other's names, right? Because that's important too. So just us knowing their names is not the only thing that's important. Anything else that people want to share, contribute, ask questions about? All right. Well, thank you so much for joining this session and participating in our CELT workshops. We have 2 more before we totally wrap up, and that's on open pedagogy, which starts at 2, and at 3 we have SUNY Create, which is a nice complement to the two.
And we have SUNY Create at the very least through the end of June, but there's a good chance we'll have it moving forward. And the recording